So today I'm just going to talk about a project that I did using some text data that I found. And the main goal of the project was to use serverless architecture in AWS to essentially use Lambda functions to do different data processing tasks. And so the data that I was working with was a COVID-19 data set, which was a bunch of JSON files that represented the contents of different journal articles published on COVID-19 from a biomedical archive. So we started the project with this repository. Overall, the main steps that I took in the project were to use Cloud9 as my IDE in AWS to essentially clone the repository here into a compute instance in Cloud9. And then I wanted to just kind of select some of the features, the paper title, the paper ID, the title, the abstract from the larger JSON files, and then save those files in an S3 bucket. And then from there, I wanted to upload those processed JSON files into a database. So I use DynamoDB. And then the main kind of focus of the project was just to use and become familiar with using producer and consumer Lambda functions. And so these are kind of a cool method that you can use within AWS and other cloud platforms to execute functions in an asynchronous way. So let's jump in then to what we actually did. So here in Cloud9, we, as you can see, have the functions that I use to get the JSON data into DynamoDB database. And what I have up, if you come over to the right on the little Lambda function, you'll see your local Lambda functions. And the two that I made are called consumer April 19 and producer April 19. And you can pull up those files, which are already up in front of us here. So this is the producer file. And mainly what we did was just use Boto3 to pull rows from the DynamoDB database. And effectively what this code is doing is then sending it from the database to a queue of jobs that will then be processed by another Lambda function. And the second Lambda function, the one we're calling the consumer function, also makes use of Boto3 to essentially read jobs from the simple query service or SQS queue, where the other Lambda function is directing payloads. And the main kind of processing that's going on is mostly just selecting the data that we want out of those payloads. So again, we're interested in paper ID title, and I just wanted to experiment with using a NLP service provided by AWS. So I used Comprehend Medical because these were potentially titles that had medical vocabulary. And then the goal was to save all of this into a final output S3 bucket. And so that's the underlying code. And when you're going to run these lambdas, which we'll do now, you would press deploy. So if we deploy each of them, it'll take a couple moments. But before we look at the lambdas, we'll just look at the data here in this S3 bucket is what our first producer function is going to pull from. And so these are clean JSON files. And then if we go back to an output bucket here, final entity, we'll see this is empty right now. So this is hopefully where we're going to be populating jobs after the second Lambda function has run. So now you can come to AWS Lambda. You can search for it on the search bar, and it's an application interface where you're able to see both of your Lambda functions. So we can see if we refresh, both of these were modified recently because we just deployed them again. So if we click on the producer Lambda function, you can see in this kind of visual design schema, we're using a trigger from CloudWatch Events, EventBridge, to execute the Lambda function in a serverless manner. So to actually have control over the Lambda function, we have to click on the trigger, and I already set this to be a 1-minute trigger to call the function at least once a minute. And right now it's disabled, so we can enable it, and we can save that change. So once this is enabled, we should actually have the first Lambda function firing and sending job payloads from the DynamoDB database to the SQS queue. So if we come out now and we look at our consumer function, we'll see that it is being triggered by jobs lining up in this SQS queue. So before we enable so it's currently disabled. So before we enable this consumer second Lambda function, another kind of good dashboard to look at is the SQS management console. And so this is where you have a queue, and this was the queue I created, producer 2, where the first Lambda function, the producer, is sending jobs, and where the second Lambda function is consuming from. So if we look at this queue, if we refresh, we can now see that messages are being populated there. And if we are selecting this queue, we can again see that there's the same amount. So we can look at the queue specifically and just sample messages. So this is an example of, if we look at more details, this is an example of the kind of JSON format or dictionary format payload that is in the queue, where we have our paper ID, we have an abstract, and we have a title for whatever article was in that row of the database. So we can close that there, and we can see that they're being populated, which is good, and that's happening currently. So if we close that, we can refresh and see, and we're getting more messages put into that queue. So we know the first Lambda function is working. So if we go back to Lambda and go back to our consumer Lambda function, we can click on the trigger, which is that queue that we were just looking at. We can enable our second consumer Lambda function now. It's enabled. Save that update. And now we're back looking at the queue, and we can see that there were 402 messages previously, and now we can see that that number can potentially be decreased because now the consumer application is actually working on those jobs that are being produced in the queue. So if we press it again, we'll see that number can move depending on how the producer function and the consumer function are working on those jobs in the queue. We can look back at our output end product S3 bucket that we had our second Lambda function pointing to direct the outputs. And now we can see that this is full of our processed end JSON files. And so for instance, we could just click on one, and now we can see we have paper ID, we have a title that is relevant to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19. And we can see the medical comprehend simple NLP processing job that we did, which is just entity prediction or entity identification. And so that is what the rest of this data involves. And it's just kind of identifying different components of the title. So, all right, thank you.